I'm supposed to act like they aren't here, assuming there's a they at all. It may just be my imagination. Whatever it is that's watching, it's not human. It doesn't ever blink. What does a scanner see? Into the head? Down? Into the heart? Does it see into me? Into us? Clearly? Or darkly? I hope it sees clearly, because I can't any longer see into myself. I see only murk. I hope for everyone's sake the scanners do better, because if the scanner sees only darkly the way I do, then I'm cursed. And cursed again. And will only wind up dead this way.
I think the experience of this year has brought security, its extents, its justifications, its methods, its general unpleasantness, to the front of a lot of people's minds. Even those of us who have had not what you might call a personal interaction with the virus have had our lives nonetheless impacted by it in ways few things ever will again. Ironically then, this impact for me has been defined above all else by boredom. A boredom which has led me again and again to my computer, losing otherwise still wasted hours binge-watching YouTube. Though in so doing, I came across this video by PhilosophyTube that certainly seemed well placed to express something in the way of our collective frustration. However, upon watching the video, I must say I came away dissatisfied with the perspective I was being presented with and how the conclusion was reached. Now, frankly, if you're familiar with the form of partisan affiliation Abby holds, it's not really necessary to watch her video to know the conclusion, which isn't to say it's devoid of agreeable arguments or less enjoyable to watch than what I'm about to subject you to. But its familiar dimensions do take the useful form of an ideological reflection that I can poke at as I speak, and I think it's necessary to do so because long after this virus has passed away, the problem of terrorism, in particular in our epoch defined as Islamic terrorism, will still exist.
Before we do this though, I'm just going to back up for a few seconds and briefly go over what we mean when we're talking about security. Maybe there'll be time to delve more into the meta-justifications of this, but for the purposes of this video I'll be taking a constructivist view, which can relate our conceptual grounding to a theoretical perspective that accounts for the multi-dimensional nature of security. For this I'm going to point to the Copenhagen School of Understanding, and in particular the work of Arie Buzan. Some of this may come across as obvious, but I think for the sake of consistency, it's necessary to make clear our definitions so as to not get lost in the process. The definition of security, as it relates to international security, form Abby is concerned with, given the nature of threat being discussed in the video, one finds in Buzan's subject-defining work, Security, a New Framework for Analysis. It's actually very similar to a definition floated by Abby, if somewhat more expansive, which states that security is about survival when a referential object is faced with existential threat. Given this is the case, security can be seen as inherently reactive, even if the reaction is to a matter of perception. Take, for example, just to be clear, an instance in which you're attacked in the street. In such an instance, the object of reference would be your life, and the existential threat would, by extension, be your death at their hands. However, in the realm of power politics and international security, the nature of threat and object can never truly be defined in such a simplistic manner. The nature of threat is always intersectional and multi-layered, as much as the oft vulnerable object. As such, Buzan goes on to describe threat within 5 interrelated categories, these being military, political, economic, societal, and environmental. Though at times these categories can appear in their descriptions somewhat primitive, the establishment of threat as transcending mere direct violence is an incredibly important grounding when dealing with some of the more vulgar attempts to quantify threat, such as along the lines of death counts and so on. You know that old line, terrorism is responsible for X amount of deaths per year, so why should we give a shit? As if that were the only consideration, or even a constant state of affairs. When we're dealing with specific instances of violence, one always has to be aware of the potential ramifications of an act beyond simply the action itself. As Abby said in her video, none of us at the time understood what 9/11 would come to mean. Anyway, for the purposes of this video, we're going to be concerned with 2 of these concepts of security, the first being political, defined in relation to the autonomy of the self, or extended self, to its own determination being the referent object, against a host of potential existential threats which seek to impede one's own freedom to act according to one's own informed will. The second being societal, defined in relation to the continuity of the essential character of a given group or underlying enterprise, usually in response to some other group liquidating that self-perception in a way that brings into question the potential of its long-term survival. Perhaps the nuances surrounding threat may appear at this moment to be a digression, but I promise we'll swing around to it later. For now though, let's address the points of the video. Really, overall, there are 4 topics that are presented in the argument, these being threat perception, the origin of threat, the excesses of security, and the time frame of securitization. Of course not compartmentalized in a completely consistent chronology, but nonetheless fit in this description throughout the video. Beginning not exactly as the video does, but to some extent, we'll be looking at this notion of threat perception. Throughout the first half of the video, Abby makes several references to this notion of the realm of maybe.
So the second interesting dimension of airports and time is threat. Scholar Sarah Ahmad points out that the threat against which security is supposedly defending us is always located in the future, the possible future to be exact. It's not like when you're accused of a crime and you're innocent until proven guilty, or if the police want to search your house, they have to get a warrant by showing evidence that they need to search you and that you might be involved in something dodgy. In an airport, everybody is searched. That's just the way we do it. You're guilty until proven innocent, until you're cleared for takeoff. The threat against which security is meant to defend us is always located in the realm of maybe, in the realm of possibility, in the realm of, well, nothing's been proven and we don't have any evidence to suggest anything specific, but...
Now, a large part of what constitutes my problem with this video is its simultaneous neglect of overall trends, an attempt to, so to speak, atomize threat perception from the perspective of the securitized, then to talk about the pervasive and all-encompassing nature of security without reference to the perception of threat being located not simply in the atomized event, but within a historical and political context. One can see this in the use of the phrase, nothing's been proven and we don't have any evidence to suggest anything specific. Clearly this is a reference to the individual experience of security, what evidence there is against you. But the term specific is somewhat of a red herring here. After all, it's not you, the individual, that has caused the emergence of security. And there may be those who say that this is exactly the critique, but if this is so, it has to show why security isn't justified within that wider political context where there does exist pervasive threat. Given this neglect of political context, the video fails to explain and at times seems to deny the existence of threat, and by extension fails to accurately describe the reasons for securitization or to point to a possibility for amelioration or demobilization. As it is put in the video,
the present hence becomes preserved by defending the community against the imagined others, who may take form in ways that cannot be anticipated, a not yetness, which means the work of defence is never over, which would seem to suggest that security may never go back to the way it was. It can't. The surveillance and the paranoia and the invasive measures can only ever expand because it's not actually grounded in any presently knowable facts about threat or safety. The whole game is about risk managing the possible future. And since what might happen in the future is infinitely imaginable, the justification for more security becomes infinite too.
This perception of genuine threat being removed from the processes of securitization denies that the solution can have anything to do with the overcoming of threat, and must therefore exist only in the rolling back of security, while still remaining in the social context that produced the security in the first place. However, as you go on to watch Abby's video past this point, the point of declaring that securitization has nothing to do with presently knowable facts, she goes on to reference the existence of threat.
It's also worth noting that this security logic mindset kind of treats terrorism as if it's inevitable, or at the very least that more security is definitely the only and the best way of preventing it. But that might stop us from becoming curious about why do people commit horrible acts of terror? What are their rationalizations for it? And what might we do to stop people being pushed towards those rationalizations in the first place? The security mindset treats terrorists as just like a blank force of nature, like a natural disaster. But as uncomfortable as it might be to face this fact, they are people. They have perspectives that can be understood by us, though not condoned, obviously.
Though that is, unfortunately, really as far as Abby goes in the video in directly attempting to describe the nature of threat, presenting us with a book hidden behind a paywall of which she describes none of its content. It seems to continue along the lines of dismissing threat, but yet it does simultaneously concede that threat exists, but in no way gives us any grounding to understand what that threat is or how it may be transcended, which matters when you're making a video on security, its utility and relevance. The only other section of the video which could be interpreted to have an explanatory potential involves a relationship which Abby highlights between security itself and the creation of threat.
In his book The Muslims Are Coming, communications professor Aaron Kunani describes a vicious cycle of authorities paying attention to people. An agent provocateur operation is when law enforcement agencies send an undercover operative into a group that they think is suspicious in order to try and bait them into committing a crime for which they can then be arrested. And Kunani points out that if law enforcement agencies already consider a certain group of people, say Muslims, to be suspicious, they will send more undercover operatives into that group of people relative to other groups, thereby inciting more crimes from that group, resulting in more trials of people from that group, meaning that the public and juries will come to view that group as more dangerous and suspicious, meaning that law enforcement agencies will send more people in to investigate them, and the whole cycle goes around again.
As I say, it's not clear if Abby's claiming that it's only security that manifests terrorism, though if this isn't the case, nor does she say the degree to which she believes it contributes to this phenomenon. However, I do believe the impact of security is definitely relevant in this regard, and it is the only social context which one can relate to the origins of terrorism within the video, so it is necessary to delve into this, and one should be sympathetic with the view that, as with all social relations, there involves a dialectic in which the implementation of a policy manifests a new contradiction which manifests a new policy, and so on. But, while granting the claim that security does play a role in radicalization, it nonetheless doesn't change a fundamental problem with the video. Either A, threat is an irrelevance and never tangible to they who securitize, or B, it is tangible and relevant.
لناچه کد بعد دست داعشی داعش دی برباد دی کشتبا دی سرجی کربا گلک شولاجی چیکرین گلک کچک اغتصاب وان کرین
الله يخليك لا تضرب اخلاق الله يا شيخ لا تضرب
بله پشتی وال خلکماتی و مروف دي أخا خب هاريزي ومروف دي وطني خب هاريزي مروف بشرف شهيد ببي يا باش.
At its height in 2015, only 3 years prior to the posting of this video, the Islamic State controlled an area of territory which stretched from the western reaches of the Aleppo countryside to the gates of Baghdad, ruling over a population of approximately 8 million people, with a military force of some 25,000 to 30,000 militants, a size growing and falling daily through new recruits and new losses. A group which had openly declared war on the rest of the world, was carrying out and planning attacks continuously, such as the massacre at the Bataclan, and as stated was indoctrinating and radicalizing entire generations ruled under them. The question then becomes, how exactly does one not respond to this in a securitized fashion? It seems ridiculous to even ask, so much so that it may be assumed to be a straw man of Abby's position, but yet this really does go unaddressed, which is especially concerning given Abby's solution to invasive security is just stopping that security. So if we're going to consider Abby's policy suggestions properly, it becomes necessary for us to alone try and theorize how in particular Islamic terrorism emerges, being that it is the preeminent source of securitization in Western countries vis-a-vis terrorism, its position in the world, and the relationship it has with security.
There is no one jihadism in the world today. Depending on geography, culture, history, sect, what jihadism means to they who practice it can be so vastly distinct as to require war between one another. From the revolution-building basework of the Muslim Brotherhood, to the perpetual revolution of Walayat al-Faqih, from the far enemy jousting of Al-Qaeda to the genocidal engineering of the Islamic State. All of these claim the right to rule the so-called Muslim world and beyond. And given this is the case, it's difficult to imagine what might constitute a solution or how I might reduce it to the space of one video. And I'm not going to attempt that, but what I will try and do is underline the significance of ideology. Yes, that ideology exists in relation to historical forces and policies, which include security, but exists as a contingent reaction, and not one interested solely in the factor highlighted by Abbey. However, before doing this, let us first underline the relationship between security, othering, and political Islam from the perspective of those who participate in it.
Jihadism, by dint of it being a form of fascism, is heavily interested in the other in all of its conflicting configurations, though what constitutes the breadth of that other is, between competing visions of Islamism, extremely fluid, as much as can be the notion of the Ummah. And to the question of what constitutes the placement and utility of terrorism to these groups, much of that is grounded in this conception of other. In particular, what I'm referring to is loosely known as the near-far enemy distinction. Though these enemies are always to some extent perceived as interlinked and acknowledged to be obstacles to the ultimate goals of political Islam, this distinction refers to the allocation of resources and strategy for the transcendence of the current state of affairs. The near enemy from this understanding can be described as a multiplicity of political, cultural, and philosophical forces which exist within the Muslim world. Within the Neglected Duty, a text published by Mohammed abd-al-Salam Faraj, the leader of the Egyptian-based Tanzim al-Jihad, an autochthonous and early jihadist group, this distinction was first really outlined. The text, heavily inspired by the proto-Salafist Ibn Taymiyyah, makes the argument that participation in jihad for the establishment of an Islamic State is an even greater duty than any pious form of living, such as upholding fast, giving zakat to the needy, etc. He even claims, Faraj this is to be clear, that to participate in these acts in absence of governance by an Islamic State would be by itself wrong. In other words, the participation in acts of everyday Muslim life in absence of domination is, from his perspective, unacceptable. The goal of near-enemy theorists of jihadism is both the cultural transformation of society to a state of radicalism and the destruction of non-Islamic political regimes in the Muslim world, before the eventual fascistic fantasies about global conquest come to pass. Far enemy theorists, on the contrary, argued that the most immediate moral obligation for Muslims was the targeting of perceived foreign actors intruding upon Muslim land. Most immediately at the time when this perspective was coming into being, this referred to the targeting of Israel. It's worth noting that the preeminent ideologues of this perspective were Palestinian, such as Fatih al-Shakaki and Abdullah Azam. As stated, initially the direct utility of the far enemy strategy was seen through this lens of expelling non-Islamic territorial intrusion, such as in Palestine and Afghanistan. And though, when reading Azam's work, one can quickly find justifications for what he refers to as offensive jihad, essentially piracy and forced conversion, it isn't a central component of his concerns. However, as time passed, both perspectives became temporarily supplanted on the world stage by the calls of al-Qaeda to focus on aggressive outward attacks on the far enemy in all contexts, with the goal of expelling Western influence from the Muslim world, essentially dissolving the mechanism through which the near enemy endures, namely Western assistance, and then overcoming these regimes and establishing a caliphate. One can then see the manner in which the experience of security impacts the manner of reaction. The advocates for near-enemy policy emerged in the aftermath of the regime of Nasser under the placation of Sadat, whereas the advocates for attacking the far have their experiences of conflict embodied in the arms of the Israeli state. But let us for a moment remember that the extent of oppression is not simply a fact, but the interaction between the world and one's opinion of it.
Let's just recall how anti-Semitism functions. In its fascist version, anti-Semitism, or rather the figure of the Jew, the Jewish plot, is precisely an external trauma which brutally intrudes, disturbing social balance, curving, as it were, the social space. Society was supposed to be harmonious, balanced, then Jews intervened, distorted its, as it were, natural order. But of course, here at least we should be Marxist and turn things around. It's not that there is disorder, antagonism, disintegration, class struggle because of the Jews. Class struggle, or more generally social antagonism, comes first. That is to say, social space is in itself already curved, imbalanced. And in order to imaginarily, in an imaginary way, account for it, we invent the figure of the Jew. That is to say, we project the cause of it into the figure of the Jew.
One oft too readily concedes to the fascist the notion of their oppression based upon the material reality of their associations. One might look to the rule of the West Bank or the murderous dictatorships of the Middle East and sympathise with the victim, hoping to see an end to this imposition, and so we should. Perhaps there has been no better moment in this century than that of the Arab Spring, this moment of radical collective human emancipation. But let us not misunderstand the fascist, for when they say to us, "I am oppressed," they do not just mean, look to the dungeons of Sisi and Assad where men are made into bodies. They mean, look at the women who I must hear in public. Look at the Yazidi with whom I must breathe the same air. Look at the communists and Rafida and Jews who work in the shadows to bring a degenerate way of life to the people I have a right to own. So when we talk about how an end to persecution will bring terrorism to a close, remember, do you know what it means for a fascist to be free? Free to rule, and free to ram a boot into another's neck. And let us not imagine that this mentality is simply the result of experiencing what we can all agree is oppression. For Sayyid Qutb, arguably the most influential Islamist in modern history, existence as a Muslim is impossible without rule by an Islamic State. In other words, as he puts it, the forms of social antagonism emergent within broader Islamic society are impossible to transcend without fealty to an unmovable dictatorship. Mankind today is on the brink of a precipice. Humanity is threatened not only by nuclear annihilation, but also by the absence of values. The West has lost its vitality, and Marxism has failed. At this crucial and bewildering juncture, the turn of Islam and the Muslim community has arrived, but before Islam can lead, it must regenerate itself. Qutb divides the world into two camps, Islam and Jahiliyyah, the period of ignorance and barbarity that existed before the divine message of the Prophet Mohammed. Qutb uses the term to encompass all of modern life, manners, morals, art, literature, law, even much of what passed as Islamic culture. He was not opposed to modern technology, but to the worship of science, which he believed had alienated humanity from its natural harmony with creation. Only a complete rejection of rationalism and Western values offered the slim hope of a redemption of Islam. This was the choice, pure, primitive Islam, or the doom of mankind. His revolutionary argument placed nominally Islamic governments in the crosshairs of jihad. The Muslim community has long ago vanished from existence, Qutb contends. It was crushed under the weight of those false laws and teachings which are not even remotely related to the Islamic teachings. Humanity cannot be saved unless Muslims recapture the glory of their earliest and purest expression. We need to initiate the movement of Islamic revival in some Muslim country, he writes, in order to fashion an example that will eventually lead Islam to its destiny of world domination. There should be a vanguard which sets out with this determination and then keeps walking the path, Qutb declared. I have written milestones for this vanguard, which I consider to be awaiting reality, about to be materialized. Those words would echo in the ears of generations of young Muslims who are looking for a role to play in history. When reading into and around Islamist ideology, one must keep in mind the overriding irrational tendency of social paranoia, which emerges in much the same way it does in competing totalitarianisms such as Nazism, where the first and principal analysis of foreign or different action is in its relation to decay, in its proactive attempts to undermine and infect Islamic society, as is the case with those who propagate the notion of social degeneracy in Western societies. As described by the previous Qutb quote, one can see the manner in which pervasive social ills are explained by the existence of behaviour which goes unprescribed by supernatural injunction. It makes clear the manner in which the power and essential quality of Islamic society is undermined by practices of political and religious toleration, and that the transformation of Islamic society into one of domination and leadership requires a purge of cultural distinction, innovations and abnormalities which have declined Islamic power. The Muslims will have no victory or superiority over the aggressive infidels such as the Jews and the Christians until there is a total annihilation of those under them, such as the apostate agents headed by the Rafida. Jerusalem was only retrieved at the hands of Saladin, even though Nur-ad-Din Mahmud was harsher on the Crusaders than Saladin. It was Allah's will that the victory and the liberation of Jerusalem would come at Saladin's hands only after he fought the Fatimids of Egypt for several years and totally annihilated their state and overthrew it. And from then he could focus on the Crusaders, and victory was awarded to him, and he retrieved Jerusalem, which had remained captive for years under their grip because of the treachery of the Rafida. This is a very important lesson that history gives us that should not be overlooked at all. We will not have victory over the original infidels until we fight the apostate infidels simultaneously along with the original infidel. The Islamic conquest had occurred under the reign of the four righteous caliphs, only occurred after the Arabian Peninsula was cleansed of apostates, and that is why the most hated figure amongst the Rafida is Saladin, and they would rather tolerate death than tolerate him. The point to be underlined is the manner in which relation to the foreign entity exists in both the reactive and possessive forms simultaneously. That is to say, from the perspective of the supremacists, the distinction between their autonomy and their right to power over others is a fiction. If there is to be any other, that other exists in and of itself to be an enemy or subordinate. In other words, the existence of an unsubjugated distinction is, in and of itself, anathema. Throughout the totality of Islamist thought there exists this underlying principle, that autonomy is required not for its own sake, but rather for the right to rule. In its basic understanding of social relations, one then realizes the untenability of a compromise which would never be satisfactory. As with the claims of Finnish Germaniae, one perceives that for the fascists it's not a distinction between war and peace, but rather war and decay, so long as the other exists.
And as our colleague Arundhati Roy wrote the other night, as she ended her article, she said, you have a very simple choice, justice or civil war, and you choose. There's, as Suketu said, this is the entire spectrum of possibility from A to B. And I want to really take issue with this, because it's... because, I mean, I think anyone who knows what I have written in my life knows that I am quite seriously concerned with the condition of Kashmir. And I think that the Indian authorities are culpable in the way in which they have treated the ordinary people of Kashmir, but so are Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba. And you have the people of Kashmir caught between a rock and a hard place. You know, you have a kind of fanatic Islam arriving from Pakistan, which is not in keeping with the Sufistic Islam that is traditional in Kashmir. And so you have this Arabized Islam being forced upon people, on the one hand, at the point of a gun. And on the other hand, you have Indian security forces treating all Kashmiris as if they're terrorists, and often very brutally. Yeah. You know, so that's there. But the point I want to make is, I do not believe that terrorists such as these, I do not believe that their project has anything to do with justice. Ask yourself the question, that if the Kashmir problem were resolved tomorrow, if Israel and Palestine reached a lasting peace, do we believe that Al-Qaeda would disband? Do we believe that Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed would put their guns down, beat them into plowshares, you know, and say, we will now be farmers, because our job is done? I mean, the point is, it's laughable, right? And the point about that is that that is not their project. No. That's not their project. Their project is power. Right. Their project, this is a power grab by the most obscurantist, you know, revanchist, old-fashioned, medievalist idea of modern culture. An attempt to drag the world back into the Middle Ages at the point of modern weaponry.
Abby ends her video by asking the question, when will security end? Of course, this question, when applied to irrelevant or counterproductive security measures, the answer will hopefully be, as soon as we can demonstrate they aren't doing anything. But for me, and I think everyone else, the essence of the question involves asking, when will security measures in general be removed, or at least reduced? And what I hope I've shown, if nothing else, is that this is an extremely contingent question, one that's asked in the way that it is due to Abby's, I would say, underdeveloped understanding of threat, at least insofar as she presents it in the video. Indeed, when somebody attempts to situate what constitutes Islamism in its securitized form, then they would realize that to categorize it as being inherently reactive to, say, hard power, misses what constitutes its essential securitizing character. It may seem reductive to frame Islamism through this lens of a securitized reaction, but to a large extent it's true, and that securitization is inherently societal, not political or militaristic, as I believe I've demonstrated. As such, the negation of threat from our perception must not simply involve demobilization on our part, but rather a fundamental shift in the perception of other and self from the perspective of those who are vulnerable to radicalization. Insofar as this is true, it becomes clear that security is by no means a solution to the threat of terrorism, but to the degree that it is effective at preserving life, it is necessary. And until there is an overcoming of this ideological perspective that I've described, it would seem that security will be, unfortunately, around for quite a while. I hope I didn't come across as too pretentious. I'm new to this whole YouTube thing, and I especially apologise for how scuffed my audio recordings are. But I do think insofar as YouTube politics is concerned, which includes BreadTube, the general level of foreign policy discussion is not, in my experience, that great. So I hope I made an informative video that someone got something out of, and if you have any questions or criticisms, please leave them below. And stick around for more vids to come. Thanks.